Settle yourself down. Perhaps the room is already quiet, the lights are low, and the world outside is beginning to fade. Let your shoulders grow heavy, and let your breath fall into a gentle rhythm. Tonight, we drift back into the Middle Ages, a time of castles and markets, of monks writing by candlelight, and of church bells ringing across sleepy villages. But while many dreamed of saints and salvation, others lived with shadows at their backs. Some were hunted, wanted, and feared. Not for their faces on a poster, but for the whispers that followed them, whispers of crimes, heresy, and rebellion. Who were the most wanted people in medieval times? Tonight, we will walk slowly through their world. The outlaw in the greenwood. When we picture the most wanted figures of the medieval world, perhaps the first that comes to mind is the outlaw, slipping into the dark woods just beyond the village boundary. The outlaw is not only a figure of lawlessness, but also of imagination, half feared, half admired, always wrapped in the smell of pine, the whisper of leaves, and the long memory of old stories. To be declared an outlaw in medieval times was not a matter of mere rumor. It was a legal status, delivered through the courts. A man or woman who refused to appear when summoned, or who broke the law and fled, might be declared outside the king's peace. This phrase carried a heavy weight. It meant the law no longer protected you. Anyone who wished could strike you down, and the courts would not defend you. You were erased from the protections of society, stripped of rights as surely as if the cloak had been pulled from your shoulders. The reasons one might become an outlaw were many. Some stole food in hunger, a loaf of bread or a hen plucked from a neighbor's yard. Others took to violence, robbing travelers on the road. Still others fell into feuds, where a quarrel grew so fierce that one side struck too boldly, and the law came down upon them. Yet the result was the same. Once declared outlaw, you could no longer live openly in the village. The forest became your refuge. And here is where the stories begin to deepen. Medieval forests were not tidy places of trimmed paths and sunny glades. They were thick, tangled, and full of noise. Oaks stretched their branches into darkness. Pines whispered in the wind. Moss clung to damp stones. To the outlaw, the woods offered both shelter and threat. One could vanish from the sheriff's men here, melt into the trees with little more than a cloak and a knife. Yet one could also starve, lose the way, or fall prey to wild animals. We might imagine the outlaw crouched by a small fire, smoke curling upward, ears straining at every crack of twig. Perhaps he listens to the distant baying of hounds, wondering if they are chasing deer or hunting him. Perhaps he clutches a pouch with stolen bread, too stale to chew but still precious. The outlaw's life was a pattern of hunger, cold, and watchfulness. But while real outlaws lived such hard lives, the imagination of the people softened their image. In village taverns, songs told of noble bandits, who robbed only the greedy and spared the poor. One figure, remembered most clearly today as Robin Hood, came to embody this dream. Ballads sang of him in the late medieval period, though in rougher, earthier tones than the polished tales we know today. He was not always kind, nor always generous, but he was clever. He outwitted sheriffs, mocked corrupt officials, and shared the spoils of his cunning. The truth behind such figures is murky. Historians have searched court records, looking for men named Robert, Robin, or Hood who might have inspired the tales. Dozens appear, scattered across centuries. Perhaps Robin Hood was no one man at all, but the spirit of resistance itself, the outlaw reimagined as hero. Yet most real outlaws, unknown to song, met harsher fates. Some were hunted down and hanged. Some starved in the woods, their bones left for the crows. A few may have slipped across borders, vanishing into towns where no one knew their names. Their stories are quieter, unremembered, but their fear was just as sharp. The outlaw's image lingered in the medieval mind not only because of his deeds, but because of what he represented. To live outside the law was to live outside the order of the world. The Middle Ages were built on bonds, of lord to vassal, of tenant to land, of parish to priest. Everyone belonged somewhere, tethered by duty. The outlaw, by contrast, was cut loose. He lived by wits and strength, belonging nowhere. For some, this was terrifying. For others, it was strangely appealing. A figure beyond rules, walking only by the measure of his own will. In the legal records, we glimpse how seriously this status was taken. An outlawed man might have his possessions seized, his home taken from his family. If he appeared in public, anyone could strike him without fear of penalty. He was already condemned, his punishment written not on his body but in his absence from society. And yet, in the hush of a midnight fire, the outlaw's world may have felt wider than the villagers'. Above him, stars pricked through the branches. Around him, the forest hummed with unseen life. The creak of trees in the wind, the rustle of small animals, the distant howl of a wolf, these were his nightly companions. Every shadow was a threat, but also a shield. Every winding path was both danger and escape. For the villagers who whispered about him, the outlaw was both warning and wonder. Mothers might tell their children not to stray too far into the woods, lest the outlaw catch them. Yet in the same breath, tales painted him as daring, bold, and free. A paradox, as so many figures of folklore are. As we linger on this image, we can almost hear the slow rhythm of the forest around him. The faint crack of a fire that must be kept low. The steady breath of a man who dares not sleep deeply. The owl's call drifting through the branches. The outlaw lives in this space between fear and legend, between hunger and freedom. And as the night deepens, the forest grows darker, softer. The wanted man lies listening to the silence, half dreaming, half waking. And in the background, the branches keep swaying. Heretics and wanderers of faith. Among the most wanted figures of the medieval world, there were those who carried no sword, and shed no blood, yet were pursued just as fiercely as bandits on the road. These were the heretics, the wanderers of faith, men and women who spoke differently about God, and in doing so, unsettled the delicate harmony of church and kingdom. To understand why they were so hunted, we must rest for a moment in the world of medieval belief. Religion was not simply a private matter, not something tucked away in personal reflection. It was the fabric of life itself. The calendar revolved around holy days. The village bells marked the hours with prayers. Birth, marriage, and death were all folded into rituals blessed by priests. To belong to a community was to belong to its faith, and to step outside that faith was to step into peril. The word heretic carried a weight of dread. It was not only about doctrine, but about danger. A heretic, in the eyes of medieval society, risked not only their own soul but the souls of others. If one person began to preach a new vision, a new truth, or a private revelation, it might spread like sparks in dry grass. Suddenly neighbors might question the church's teachings, might lose trust in priests, might withdraw from the sacraments. To authorities, this was not a small crack, but a threat to the whole order of the world. And so, the heretic became wanted, sometimes by the bishop, sometimes by the king, sometimes by both. Some of these wanderers were learned scholars. They read too widely, asked too many questions, and began to propose new answers. Others were simple folk, mystics who dreamed vividly and claimed visions. Still others were fiery preachers, moving from town to town, gathering listeners in marketplaces or in fields, their voices carrying into the night. What united them was their willingness to speak against the accepted order, to imagine a different truth. Take, for instance, the Cathars of southern France. In the 12th and 13th centuries, this movement grew strong, preaching a form of Christianity that saw the material world as corrupt and evil. They rejected wealth, rejected the pomp of bishops, and sought a life of purity. To many villagers, tired of corruption and heavy taxes, the Cathar message rang with beauty. But to the Church, it was intolerable. These men and women became heretics, hunted with ferocity, condemned in sermons, and eventually crushed in bloody crusades. To be a Cathar was to live with eyes over the shoulder, never certain if tomorrow would bring sympathy or soldiers. Or consider the wandering preachers of the later Middle Ages, men who challenged the wealth of the Church, who questioned indulgences, who spoke of returning to the simplicity of Christ. Some were inspired by John Wycliffe in England, whose ideas would echo later in the Reformation. His followers, called Lollards, risked their lives simply for carrying a forbidden book, or for gathering in secret to read Scripture aloud. For these figures, the road itself was their dwelling. They moved quietly, from village to village, their cloaks worn thin by travel. They whispered their ideas by candlelight, often to small gatherings in barns or kitchens. Every meeting carried danger. A neighbor might listen, then later denounce them. A stranger might befriend them, only to betray them to the authorities. The life of a heretic was one of continual unease, yet also continual faith in the message they carried. Not all who were accused were truly heretics. Sometimes suspicion alone was enough. A woman with strange visions, who spoke of dreams too vividly, might be watched closely. A man who studied books beyond his station might be questioned. Gossip traveled quickly, and in the tight weave of medieval communities, to stand out was to risk being marked. We must imagine the loneliness of these figures. In the stillness of night, they sat awake, perhaps clutching a worn manuscript or repeating words of prayer. Their faith was both their comfort and their burden. To believe differently was to carry a flame, and that flame could draw both warmth and destruction. When captured, the fate of the heretic was grim. Some were imprisoned, their names erased from records. Others faced public trials, where their words were weighed before crowds. And some, most tragically, were burned, their bodies consumed as a warning to others. The fire was not only punishment but symbol, a way of erasing what authorities saw as dangerous contagion. Yet despite this, heresy did not vanish. The very fact that heretics were so hunted shows how persistent their voices were. One might be silenced, yet another would rise. Across centuries, across kingdoms, the rhythm repeated. Belief challenged, belief condemned, belief reborn. For the medieval imagination, the heretic was both frightening and oddly compelling. They represented not only error, but courage, a defiance of the most powerful institution in Europe. For those who sympathized quietly, the heretic might seem almost saintly, a figure who walked close to God. For those who feared, they were demons in disguise, sowing confusion. As we linger on this thought, we might imagine one such wanderer, walking along a dirt road at dusk. His shoes are worn. His satchel is light. A small Bible, copied by hand, presses against his ribs. He pauses at a stream, hearing the soft trickle of water. He knows he cannot linger long. Somewhere ahead lies a household willing to listen. Somewhere behind, perhaps, lies a sheriff already riding with orders to arrest him. The evening deepens, and he pulls his cloak tighter, whispering his prayers. His breath hangs in the cold air. In his heart, he feels both fear and unshakable conviction. And in the background, the village bells keep tolling faintly across the fields, marking the hours of prayer that he will never hear within safe walls again. Heretics, wanderers, visionaries, these were among the most wanted in the Middle Ages. They were wanted not for gold, nor for plunder, but for words, for ideas, for daring to see the world differently. Their footsteps echo faintly still, a reminder that to believe apart is to walk a lonely, dangerous road. And as the night grows quieter, we leave them in their journey, moving softly down the unmarked paths, the sound of their sandals fading, while in the background the bells keep tolling. Bandits of the high road. If the outlaw of the forest was a figure both feared and romanticized, the bandit of the high road was more practical, more immediate, and often more brutal. For most ordinary people, the greatest danger was not in distant wars or whispered heresies, but in the simple act of traveling from one place to another. The medieval road was a thread through wilderness, a narrow line connecting villages, monasteries, towns, and cities. To walk upon it was to expose oneself to the unknown. And along those dusty or muddy tracks waited the bandits, the thieves who became some of the most wanted people of the Middle Ages. Travel in medieval Europe was never swift. A merchant's cart groaned slowly under sacks of wool or barrels of ale. A pilgrim walked steadily with staff in hand, perhaps chanting prayers or humming to break the silence. A messenger might ride with urgency, the clop of his horse echoing in lonely stretches of land. And yet, all of them were vulnerable. There were no street lamps, no patrol cars, no secure borders between one parish and the next. When the road dipped into a hollow, or wound through a thicket, or skirted the edge of a marsh, danger could be waiting. Bandits were often ordinary men pushed beyond the boundaries of village life. Some were hungry peasants who had lost their land, forced into desperation. Others were veterans of war, soldiers who found peace a harsher master than battle, their skills useless in the fields. A few were nobles themselves, younger sons without inheritance, who took to robbery rather than accept poverty. For all of them, the road was opportunity. Imagine a small group, crouched in the brush at twilight. They listen for the rattle of wheels, the distant clop of hooves. Perhaps they hear the faint jingle of coins carried by a merchant, or the chanting of pilgrims as they approach. They whisper, shift their weight, ready their knives. When the travelers appear, the bandits burst forth, not with the elegance of stories, but with sudden violence. Cries ring out. A purse is torn from a belt. A chest is pried open. Sometimes blood is spilled. Sometimes it is not. But the fear remains. The authorities of towns and lords saw such men as dangerous not only for their crimes, but for what they represented. Roads were lifelines. Without safe passage, markets suffered, trade faltered, pilgrims avoided shrines, and reputations of rulers weakened. A king might boast of his power, but if merchants whispered that his roads were plagued by thieves, his strength seemed hollow. And so, bandits became hunted figures, pursued by sheriffs, by militias, even by knights ordered to restore peace. Records from medieval courts often list names of such men. Some were captured, their trials swift, their punishments harsh. Hanging was common, the bodies left to swing by the roadside as warnings. Others vanished into the countryside, evading capture for years, their names whispered like curses. "Do not take the northern road," villagers might say, "for there waits William the Red, with his men." Stories grew around them, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes softening. A ruthless thief in life might become a folk figure in memory, his crimes blurred into daring escapades. The geography of banditry also tells us much about the medieval world. Forest passes, mountain roads, and river crossings were notorious. Pilgrims traveling to Santiago de Compostela in Spain spoke of ambushes in narrow valleys. Traders on the roads to Frankfurt or Bruges dreaded certain stretches where thieves lurked. Even the roads around Rome, the very seat of Christendom, were haunted by bandits who showed little reverence for the holy city's visitors. But the life of a bandit, though feared, was not often long. The same road that brought opportunity also carried risk. A wealthy merchant might travel with guards. A pilgrim group might carry staves, willing to fight back. And when lords decided enough was enough, whole companies of soldiers swept through the countryside, burning out hideouts, scattering gangs, and dragging captives to the gallows. To be a wanted bandit was to live always on borrowed time. Yet, like the outlaw, the bandit also occupied a strange corner of imagination. For villagers who felt the weight of taxes, the sight of a merchant robbed was not always tragic. For peasants who lived with hunger, the idea of food or coin taken from the rich carried a sharp allure. And so, even as bandits were condemned, they were sometimes admired. They represented a rough justice, however violent, against a world that seemed stacked in favor of the wealthy. We might picture, for a moment, a bandit resting after a raid. He sits beneath a hedgerow, a crust of bread in hand, chewing slowly. Around him, his companions divide coins, laugh nervously, drink from a shared jug. Their eyes remain sharp, scanning the horizon. None knows when the sheriff's men might appear, or whether one of their own might betray the rest for a pardon. The bandit lives not in peace, but in the restless balance between hunger and fear. For travelers, the memory of a bandit attack lingered long after the bruises faded. Pilgrims arriving at a shrine often told stories of dangers faced, their words a mixture of terror and pride. Merchants recorded losses in their accounts, lamenting goods stolen on the road. And sometimes, the church itself responded, granting indulgences to those who suffered violence on holy pilgrimages, framing their endurance as a kind of spiritual trial. To be wanted as a bandit was to live in constant pursuit, yet also in constant presence. Your name carried across parishes, spoken in warnings, etched in records, remembered in curses. You were both feared and known, your reputation traveling faster than your feet. And as the centuries passed, the figure of the bandit blurred into song and story. Minstrels sang of daring highwaymen, of clever ambushes, of escapes through forests. These tales softened the brutality, leaving only the thrill. But behind the songs was the memory of real men, real hunger, real violence, and the cold reality of punishment. As the night deepens in our imagination, we can almost hear the lonely creak of cart wheels on a muddy track. A pilgrim's staff taps against the stones. Somewhere, hidden in the brush, a bandit waits, breath held, heart pounding. The road stretches on, silent, uncertain. And in the background, the wind sighs gently across the hedges, carrying both warning and lullaby. Pirates on cold seas. When we think of pirates today, the image that often drifts to mind is shaped by later centuries. Bright flags, cannons, and tales of the Caribbean. But long before those Golden Age figures haunted tropical waters, the seas of medieval Europe were already shadowed by their own breed of wanted men. These were the pirates of the Middle Ages, slipping across gray waves, boarding ships under moonlight, and living on the edge of law and survival. The seas of the medieval world were both highways and wilderness. They connected kingdoms, carried pilgrims to holy lands, and brought spices, silks, and salt fish to distant markets. Yet, just as the high road harbored bandits, the sea harbored pirates. For every ship that carried goods, another ship might wait in the fog, ready to pounce. The North Sea, cold and restless, was one such hunting ground. Merchant vessels set out from English ports laden with wool, from Flemish harbors with cloth, from Scandinavia with timber and iron. Their voyages were slow, their sails heavy, their hulls creaking with the burden of trade. To a pirate crew, they were moving treasure chests, ripe for the taking. Further south, the Mediterranean shimmered with its own dangers. Here, Italian merchants sailed between Genoa, Venice, and Constantinople, their holds packed with luxury goods. Pilgrims traveled by sea to Jerusalem, trusting their fate to fragile vessels. And along those same routes, pirates hovered, often indistinguishable from ordinary fishermen until the moment of attack. To live as a pirate was to live between worlds, never quite at home in any port, never fully welcome on any shore. A pirate ship was both refuge and prison, the sea both protector and enemy. Food was often meager, salted fish and hard bread. Fresh water spoiled quickly in casks. Storms could scatter sails, splinter masts, and send whole crews to the bottom without a trace. And yet, the promise of plunder kept them afloat. We might imagine a crew at dawn, their ship rocking gently. The mist lies thick across the water. One sailor climbs the mast, shading his eyes. There, in the distance, a merchant vessel moves slowly, its sails sagging in the calm air. The pirates stir. Knives are checked, ropes coiled, bows strung. The captain whispers orders. And then, with sudden energy, the ship lunges forward, oars dipping, sails catching the faintest wind. The prey has been chosen. For rulers and towns, pirates were more than thieves. They were a threat to commerce, to diplomacy, to the fragile balance of trust that trade required. Kings issued orders for their capture. Towns offered rewards. Merchants hired guards or traveled in convoys, hoping safety lay in numbers. And yet piracy proved stubborn. The seas were too wide, the coves too many, the rewards too tempting. Some pirates were men of no name, forgotten soon after capture. Others grew notorious. In the 14th century, a group known as the Vitalienbrüder, the Vittel brothers, haunted the Baltic Sea. Originally hired as privateers in the war, they soon slipped beyond control, attacking any ship they pleased. They were said to cry out, "God's friends, the whole world's enemies," a motto that captured the pirate's life: outside law, outside loyalty, bound only to themselves. The line between pirate and privateer was often thin. A ship might be given license by a king to harass enemy vessels, yet in practice, it might attack friend and foe alike. To those robbed, it mattered little whether the raiders carried a royal charter. Theft was theft, and the pirates, licensed or not, remained wanted men. For the common sailor, joining a pirate crew was both desperation and opportunity. Life on land could be harsh, wages meager, masters cruel. A pirate ship promised equality of a kind. Plunder was divided more evenly than wages in a merchant's hold. Decisions were sometimes shared, captains chosen by vote. For those weary of servitude, piracy offered a rough freedom. Yet it came at the cost of constant peril, for every port might betray them, every harbor might hide soldiers waiting to pounce. Captured pirates faced grim fates. Hanging was common, their bodies displayed at harbor mouths as warnings. Some were chained to oars, condemned to row in galleys until their strength gave out. Others were executed swiftly, their names erased but their example lingering in memory. Yet, even as they died, new crews rose to take their place. The sea was too wide to police, too restless to tame. The pirate, like the outlaw and the bandit, also lived in imagination. To villagers far from the coast, tales of sea raiders were both terrifying and thrilling. To children, the idea of men who lived freely upon the waves, who defied kings and stole from rich merchants, might sound like adventure. To merchants, it was nightmare. And to rulers, it was an endless irritation, a wound upon their prestige. Let us picture, for a moment, a pirate ship at anchor in a hidden cove. The sails are furled. The water laps gently against the hull. Men move quietly, repairing ropes, sharpening blades, patching the deck. Smoke curls from a small fire where fish are being cooked. The air smells of salt and tar. Above, gulls wheel and cry, their voices sharp against the steady hush of waves. For now, the crew is safe. But they know safety is fleeting. Tomorrow, or the day after, another voyage will call, another ship will tempt, another chase will begin. And somewhere inland, in a stone hall, a scribe writes their names in a record of wanted men. A price is placed on their heads. A lord swears to see them hanged. Their infamy grows, carried on the tide, even as their lives remain bound to the rolling sea. The medieval pirate was a figure caught between myth and hunger, between daring and desperation. He was wanted not only for what he stole, but for what he represented, a life outside order, outside law, untamed as the waves themselves. As we close our eyes to their world, we can still hear it, the creak of wood, the snap of canvas, the endless hush of waves against the hull. The sea stretches out, gray and boundless. And in the background, the gulls keep crying above the cold, restless water. Rebels and pretenders. In the quiet fields of medieval life, where peasants bent their backs to the plow and lords sat in stone halls, rebellion sometimes stirred like a sudden storm. Most days, the order of things felt immovable. The king ruled, the church preached, the land was tilled, and the taxes were paid. But beneath the steady rhythm of seasons, there were moments when the fabric of obedience frayed, when voices rose against the crown, and when bold men dared to claim thrones that were not theirs. These were the rebels and pretenders, the most wanted of all, for to defy the king was to defy the heartbeat of the realm itself. A pretender was more than a thief or a pirate. He was someone who claimed he had a better right to rule, someone who could rattle the certainty of succession with a single declaration. In an age where lineage mattered more than written law, even a rumor of royal blood could inspire armies. And so kings feared pretenders deeply, for their presence meant not just danger on the battlefield, but doubt in the minds of subjects. One of the most haunting pretenders of the medieval world was Lambert Simnel. In the late 15th century, long after the Wars of the Roses had torn England apart, Simnel was presented as the rightful heir to the throne. He was but a boy, yet those who opposed Henry VII dressed him in royal finery and declared him Edward, Earl of Warwick. His supporters crowned him in Dublin, and armies marched in his name. The rebellion was crushed, yet the tale reminds us how fragile royal authority could feel. A mere child could be lifted up and turned into a threat against the king, not through his own power, but through the hopes and schemes of others. Earlier centuries, too, had their rebels. Some rose not for thrones, but for freedom. In 1381, England trembled with the peasants' revolt. It began with anger at taxes, with the grinding burden of war levies, and with resentment toward officials who seemed to prosper while common folk starved. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, the rebels surged into London, tearing through the city, demanding an end to serfdom. For a brief, trembling moment, it seemed as though the world might be turned upside down. But kings are patient, and power bends slowly back into its shape. The revolt was broken, Tyler was killed, and the leaders of the rising became fugitives. They were hunted, captured, and executed, their names entered into the grim roll of wanted men. On the continent, rebellions flowered in other soils. In Flanders, weavers and craftsmen sometimes rose against the weight of lords, demanding a say in how they lived. In France, the Jacquerie of 1358 saw peasants lash out during the 100 Years' War, their anger fed by famine and oppression. Such risings often burned brightly, briefly, before the mailed fists of knights crushed them down. Yet even in failure they left behind whispers of discontent, proof that power could be challenged, however briefly. For kings, rebels and pretenders posed the gravest danger, for they struck not at coin or cargo, but at legitimacy itself. To hunt them down was a matter not only of justice, but of survival. Wanted proclamations for rebels were not whispered notices. They were shouted, written, carried from town to town. Rewards were high, punishments harsh. Capture a thief, and you might be thanked. Capture a pretender, and you might be ennobled. The lives of rebels were precarious. They might dine in a lord's hall one day, surrounded by followers, only to scatter the next, hunted across the countryside. Some found fleeting safety in monasteries or forests, some disguised themselves as common laborers, hoping to melt into the crowd. Yet the crown's memory was long. Years later, even after the embers of revolt had cooled, those once marked as traitors could find themselves dragged before judges, the weight of old rebellion pressing down like a shadow. And what of the ordinary folk who followed them? The men who left plows to carry spears, the women who cooked for rebel camps, the youths who threw stones at manor gates. Their fates varied. Some were pardoned. Some slipped back into obscurity, their names never recorded. Others were caught in the sweep of punishment, fined heavily or worse. The crown liked to make examples, and so gallows were raised, heads displayed, bodies broken. The message was always the same: rebellion might flare, but it would not last. Still, one cannot help but imagine the nights before a rising. Picture a village, quiet under the stars. A handful of men whisper in a barn, their voices low. They speak of taxes, of lords who never listen, of dreams of freedom. In the corner, a lantern flickers, throwing long shadows on the straw. Someone sharpens a blade. Someone else makes a mark in the dirt, a crude map of where they will march. Beyond the walls, the fields lie silent, but within, a storm gathers. For a moment, in the hush of that night, they are not peasants. They are rebels. Kings and lords feared these whispers. They feared not only the swords and torches of rebels, but the dangerous idea that ordinary people might claim a voice. That idea could not be killed so easily. It lingered quiet but alive, waiting for other centuries to grow. Pretenders, too, left their mark. Some were crushed quickly, their claims forgotten. Others sparked wars that changed the fate of kingdoms. Each was a reminder that medieval order, however firm it seemed, rested on fragile ground. All it took was a name, a rumor of birthright, a banner lifted in defiance. And suddenly, the crown trembled. The rebel and the pretender were not merely criminals. They were figures of possibility, embodiments of what might be. To the rulers of their day, they were the most dangerous, the most wanted, for they dared to reimagine the order of things. And though their fates were often grim, their stories linger still, like embers glowing faintly in the ashes of the past. And so, as we let our thoughts drift with them, we may hear the muffled tread of feet on a village lane, the crackle of a distant fire, the whisper of banners unfurling in the dark. The rebellion begins, the dream takes shape, and then, slowly, it fades back into silence. And in the background, the night wind keeps sighing over the fields, soft and endless. Witches, healers, and the accused. Among the most wanted people of medieval times were not always thieves, nor soldiers, nor even rebels. Sometimes the wanted were women, women whose hands gathered herbs, whose eyes watched the skies, whose whispers carried remedies, blessings, or charms. They might be midwives helping a child into the world, or widows muttering prayers over herbs steeped in boiling water. They might be the village wise woman, trusted by neighbors in one season, shunned in another. In an age of deep faith, deep fear, and deep superstition, the line between healer and witch was as fragile as a thread. The Church taught that God alone held the power to heal and to know the unseen. Yet human need often pushed beyond that boundary. People turned to what they had: herbs in hedgerows, charms whispered at bedside, talismans carved in wood or bone. For a fever, one might tie a strip of red cloth to a wrist. For a cough, one might boil thyme in honey. For bad luck, a stone might be worn against the skin. Such practices lingered at the edges of faith, either wholly condemned nor fully blessed. But suspicion lay always in the air. A poor harvest, a sick cow, a child's sudden death, these could stir the urge to blame. And who better to accuse than the woman who seemed different, the one who knew too much of herbs, who muttered strange words, who did not quite fit? Thus, accusations of witchcraft rose like smoke from the embers of misfortune. Not all regions pursued witches with equal zeal. In some places, charges were rare, handled quietly. In others, they grew into waves of fear. By the later Middle Ages, councils and courts began to treat witchcraft not as mere superstition but as heresy, a rebellion against God Himself. To be accused of such a crime was to be marked as one of the most wanted, for heresy threatened not only neighbors but the soul of the whole community. Life for those accused was filled with shadows. Sometimes they were seized suddenly, dragged before local lords, pressed with questions. Did they consort with demons? Did they fly by night? Did they make pacts sealed with strange signs? The accused might protest innocence, yet words could twist. A birthmark could be pointed out as the devil's mark. A bag of dried herbs could be held up as evidence of sorcery. Even kindness, a cure that worked, could be reimagined as unnatural power. Yet many of these so-called witches were simply healers, working with the knowledge of plants passed down through generations. They knew that willow bark eased pain, that sage soothed the throat, that nettles strengthened the blood. Their skills were practical, born of observation, not of dark spirits. But in a world where the boundary between natural and supernatural was blurred, their wisdom could be seen as dangerous. Picture a small cottage at the edge of a village. Smoke curls gently from its chimney. Inside, shelves are crowded with dried bundles of herbs: lavender, rosemary, mint. A woman bends over a small table, grinding seeds into powder with a stone pestle. Outside, children laugh as they run past, though some cross themselves as they do. To one family, she is a healer. To another, she is a witch. The difference is only in the stories whispered about her, and in the season's luck. Punishments varied. Some accused were fined, others forced to confess and repent, others imprisoned. In the harsher courts, execution was the end, by hanging, or by fire. The flames were meant not only to kill but to cleanse, to drive away the fear of invisible devils. For communities, such punishments were spectacles, a reassurance that order was being defended. But for the accused, they were tragedies, born often of nothing more than misfortune and rumor. Not all who were wanted under the name of witch were women. Some men, too, faced accusations, especially those who practiced folk magic or who strayed from orthodox belief. Yet, women bore the greater burden, for they lived closer to the margins, more easily marked as other. A widow with no protector, a midwife whose work was shrouded in blood and mystery, a woman whose tongue was too sharp in the marketplace, any of these might be swept into the net of suspicion. And so, the figure of the witch grew in the medieval imagination, half feared, half fascinating. To rulers and churchmen, she was a threat to the faith. To neighbors, she was a scapegoat. To children, she was the shape that haunted fireside tales. Her image stretched across centuries, lingering even now in story and folklore. To be accused of witchcraft in the Middle Ages was to live in constant tension, between trust and suspicion, healing and harm. It was to know that one's very knowledge, the herbs gathered, the remedies whispered, could be turned into chains. It was to be wanted not for theft, nor for rebellion, but for being different in ways the world feared. And as we let our thoughts drift with them, we may picture the quiet of a night forest, leaves rustling gently overhead. A woman moves slowly, basket on her arm, gathering herbs by moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hoots. The air is cool, the earth damp beneath her feet. She pauses, listening, half in caution, half in peace. For in that moment she is simply herself, healer, wanderer, soul of her own making. But in the eyes of others she may already be wanted. And in the background, the forest keeps whispering, soft and endless, through the long medieval night. Spies and traitors in royal courts. The halls of medieval power were not as still as they seemed. Behind the heavy doors of palaces, behind the stone walls of castles, beyond the velvet curtains of thrones, whispers moved like hidden currents. Kings and queens sat in majesty, their crowns glinting in candlelight, Yet around them circled men and women who listened, who carried words, who weighed secrets like gold. These were the spies, the informers, the quiet betrayers. To be one of them was to live in shadows. To be discovered was to become one of the most wanted, for no crime threatened a king more deeply than treason. Medieval politics was woven of alliances and rivalries, as fragile as a spider's web. A marriage might join kingdoms, a treaty might hold peace, but trust was never whole. Every court was a place of watching eyes. Ambassadors carried letters between rulers, but they carried questions too. Courtiers bowed low before their lords, yet many had ears for foreign whispers. Even servants, pouring wine or carrying trays, might catch a phrase that could be sold for coin. The medieval spy was not always like the secret agents of later centuries, with coded letters and invisible ink. More often, they were merchants who listened in ports, monks who traveled between abbeys, clerks who copied letters and made a second copy for another master. They were ordinary in appearance, blending into the daily life of court, their danger lying in what they overheard, and what they dared to pass along. Kings feared betrayal not only of words but of blood. A lord might swear loyalty in the hall, his hand on the gospel, yet in the dark he might send promises to another ruler. Rebellions were not born overnight. They grew in whispers, in coded gestures, in letters hidden under seals. A spy who revealed such plots could change the fate of a kingdom. But a spy discovered, caught in treason, faced a fate more terrible than thief or pirate. For traitors were punished not just to kill them, but to humiliate them, to show that no one who turned against the crown could escape the full weight of wrath. Executions of traitors were staged as warnings. In England, they were often hanged, drawn, and quartered, paraded through streets, hanged half to death, cut down, disemboweled, their bodies divided and displayed at city gates. In France, beheadings before great crowds sent the same message. In every land, the traitor's name was blackened, his memory cursed. The crown wanted more than his death, it wanted the erasure of his loyalty, the burning away of his honor. And yet, despite the terror of such punishments, spies and traitors continued to appear. The temptations were great. To serve another master might bring coin, land, or promise of power. To reveal secrets might shift the balance of a war, opening doors otherwise closed. Some betrayed from greed, others from conviction, believing they served a truer cause. Some were caught in webs beyond their control, forced by threat or blackmail. Imagine, for a moment, a royal hall at night. The feast has ended. The long tables are littered with bones and empty cups. Torches still burn along the walls, casting shadows that flicker and stretch. A servant moves silently, collecting dishes. In a corner, a clerk gathers parchments, rolling them into tubes. He pauses, glances around, then slips one small scroll under his sleeve. His heart beats quickly, though his face remains calm. Tomorrow, that scroll will pass into another's hands, carrying words not meant to leave the hall. In that quiet act, he has stepped onto a path that may lead to gold, or to the gallows. Not all spies served foreign kings. Some worked for their own rulers, gathering intelligence on neighbors, lords, even clergy. Kings prized information. To know what one's enemies plotted was as useful as any sword. To discover a rebellion before it rose was to smother fire before flame. Thus spies were valued, but also expendable. A king might reward a loyal informer, yet deny him if caught. To be a spy was to live between favor and abandonment, useful one moment, disposable the next. In the tapestry of medieval wanted men, the spy was the most invisible. Unlike outlaws in the forest, bandits on the road, or pirates at sea, spies carried no banners, wore no disguises of roughness. They dressed as courtiers, clerks, or travelers, their danger hidden in plain sight. When discovered, their fall was all the sharper, for betrayal carried the deepest sting. To the medieval imagination, the traitor was a figure of horror. Dante, in his great poem of the Inferno, placed traitors in the very lowest circle of hell, frozen in ice for eternity. Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Christ, was the image against which all others were measured. To call someone a Judas was the darkest of accusations, and many spies and traitors heard that name hurled at them as they went to their deaths. Yet there was fascination too. Tales of courts were filled with plots, intrigues, and double-dealings. To those far from power, these stories were distant dramas, reminding them that even kings lived in danger. To courtiers themselves, suspicion was part of survival. Trust was rare. Friendship could turn to betrayal overnight. In such a world, to be wanted as a traitor was a fear that touched all ranks, from the lowliest scribe to the highest lord. And so, when we picture spies and traitors in medieval times, let us hear the softer sounds of their world. The scratching of quills on parchment. The quiet creak of a leather-bound chest opening to hide letters. The soft click of a seal pressed into hot wax. In the silence of night, a horse's hooves on cobbles as a messenger slips through the gate. And always, the knowledge that discovery waits just beyond the next dawn. As we let our thoughts drift with theirs, we can feel the heavy hush of candlelit chambers, the weight of secrets unspoken. In those spaces, danger was not loud but silent, not in the clash of swords but in the passing of words. And in the background, the faint rustle of parchment keeps echoing, steady and endless, in the long corridors of medieval courts. Runaway serfs and escaped prisoners. The medieval world was filled with boundaries, both visible and invisible. Walls of stone, fences of thorn, rivers and forests marked the lands of lords and kings. But there were also human boundaries, obligations, duties, and laws that bound peasants to the soil and prisoners to their cells. To break free from these bonds was to risk being hunted, to become, quite literally, one of the most wanted figures of the age. A serf was, in many ways, tied to the rhythm of the land. Born into a village, raised on the lord's manor, the seasons of planting, harvesting, and tending livestock dictated daily life. The lord claimed a share of crops, the peasant owed labor on roads or in fields, and the freedom to leave was often forbidden. Yet not all accepted these bounds quietly. Some dreamed of running, of slipping into distant forests, joining towns where no one knew their name, or crossing rivers to lands beyond the reach of their lord. The act of escape was simple in thought but perilous in practice. A runaway serf had to move carefully, often by night, carrying little more than hope and the clothes on their back. Fields and forests became both sanctuary and trap. Rivers could be crossed, yet might be patrolled. Villages could offer refuge, yet strangers were watched closely. To be caught could mean whipping, imprisonment, or being sold to another lord far away. Prisoners, too, faced this tension between confinement and the vast open world. Medieval prisons were crude, dark, and damp, often little more than stone cells with iron bars. Some were kept in solitary, their names marked in ledgers, their faces pressed to the cold walls. Others were held with dozens of others, sharing limited food, water, and air. Escape was a dream of freedom, a chance to slip beyond the authority that bound them. But the risks were severe. Guards were vigilant. Dogs patrolled the corridors. Every door could be locked, every window barred. And yet some did escape, their names quickly added to the growing list of wanted men and women. The punishment for being caught was not merely physical. Lords, kings, and sheriffs wanted the message to spread. Notices might be posted at village gates, describing the escapee in detail, their age, clothing, any distinguishing marks. Rewards could be offered for capture, and neighbors encouraged to report sightings. In some regions, churches participated in the hunt, declaring that harboring fugitives was a sin. To run, therefore, was to live constantly in fear, never certain where safety might lie. Yet there were stories, passed quietly through generations, of successful escapes. A serf might flee to a city, take up work as a laborer or craftsman, and slowly fade into anonymity. A prisoner might slip through secret passages, bribe a guard, or vanish in a stormy night, leaving behind chains and misery. Such stories carried both warning and inspiration, a lesson of peril, and a whisper of hope. We might imagine one such fugitive moving through the forest at dusk. The sky softens to lavender. Leaves rustle underfoot. His cloak is threadbare, shoes worn thin. He pauses to listen, to catch the distant sound of a dog's bark or a watchman's horn. A stream reflects the fading light. He drinks quickly, then moves on, heart pounding with fear and anticipation. Every shadow could hide danger, yet the promise of freedom drives him forward. The life of the runaway was a constant negotiation with the landscape itself. Hills offered hiding places. Thick hedgerows concealed movement. Marshes, though treacherous, could serve as barriers against pursuers. And so the medieval landscape was both ally and adversary, shaping the flight of those who dared to leave. There was also a rhythm to their journeys, dictated by the necessities of survival. Food had to be found, often foraged, sometimes stolen. Shelter was temporary, a barn loft, a cave, an abandoned building. Nights were cold, and storms made travel slow and dangerous. And yet, even in hardship, there was a clarity of purpose. Every step taken away from the Lord's claim, every mile traveled, was a step toward a life imagined differently. In towns and cities, fugitives might find work under false names. Markets were bustling, yet offered anonymity. Inns and taverns were filled with strangers whose eyes did not judge. And yet, even here, fear lingered. Every official, every stranger, might be a threat. To rest, one had to hide carefully, to speak cautiously, to trust only as much as circumstance allowed. The story of the runaway serf and escaped prisoner reminds us that the most wanted were not always violent, not always ambitious in worldly terms. Sometimes they were simply those who sought liberty, those who dreamed of walking beyond the boundaries imposed upon them. To the authorities, they were dangerous, not for what they took, but for what they represented: defiance of order, assertion of choice, and the challenge to the control of others. As we let our thoughts linger with these figures, we can picture a quiet forest glade at midnight. The moon casts silver light through branches. The fugitive crouches beside a stream, listening to the soft ripple of water, feeling the damp earth under his hands. The night is still, except for the whisper of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and the gentle sigh of wind across the trees. Here, in this temporary refuge, he is both hunted and alive, caught between fear and freedom, between the past he has left and the unknown that awaits. And in the background, the forest keeps breathing, soft and steady, echoing the steps of those who dared to run, the most wanted not for crime, but for courage, for desire, and for the simple, fragile hope of liberty. The most dangerous outlaws of all. Among all the wanted figures of medieval times, there existed a small group whose danger was not measured merely in coins stolen, messages betrayed, or lands fled. These were the outlaws who moved beyond the law entirely, those declared enemies of every authority, whose very names were enough to cause fear to ripple through villages, courts, and even royal halls. They were dangerous because they refused the boundaries that constrained all others, living entirely outside the rules that bound ordinary people. To be an outlaw in medieval law was to exist in a kind of suspended space. You were no longer a member of the community. No oath of loyalty, no pledge of servitude, no agreement could protect you. Some were criminals in the ordinary sense, murderers, thieves, robbers. But others became outlaws simply by defying kings, breaking feudal contracts, or escaping justice in a way that could not be forgiven. Once declared outlaw, you were cut off, legally, socially, and morally. Outlaws roamed forests, hills, and ungoverned roads. Some formed bands, living in hidden glades, caves, or abandoned ruins. They were known by descriptive names: William the Red, Black Roger, Thomas of the Hollow, names that spread quickly from village to village, whispered with fear, awe, and sometimes reluctant admiration. Their stories traveled faster than their feet, warning travelers, delighting children by fireside, and haunting the dreams of those in power. Some outlaws were remarkable not only for their crimes, but for their cunning. They knew the lay of the land intimately, the hidden paths through forests, the shallow fords and rivers, the caves where food could be stored and eyes kept sharp. They might strike suddenly, rob a traveling merchant, and vanish without trace, leaving behind only broken wheels and frightened horses. And yet, they were not always cruel. Some lived by their own code, taking from the rich, sparing the poor, providing refuge for those cast aside. In these cases, their fame grew not only as wanted criminals, but as folk heroes, figures of stories and legend. The most dangerous outlaws were feared because their actions were unpredictable. A bandit on the road might attack only under certain conditions. A pirate might confine plunder to enemy ships. But an outlaw had no predictable pattern, no allegiance, and no negotiation. Any village, any traveler, could find themselves caught in the consequences of his choices. Kings and sheriffs tried to track them, sometimes using spies, sometimes offering amnesty for betrayal, sometimes hunting them with entire militias. Still, the outlaws' freedom, and their knowledge of terrain, often gave them the advantage. Outlaws also served as mirrors of the society that created them. Many were pushed into lawlessness by poverty, injustice, or war. Soldiers discharged without land or pay, peasants robbed of inheritance, men betrayed by lords, each could take to the forest in desperation. Their lives were harsh, exposed to cold, hunger, and danger. The forest was a home that offered food and concealment, yet threatened with wolves, disease, and treacherous weather. And yet, their freedom, precarious and fleeting, was a freedom denied to most. Kings and courts considered outlaws public enemies. Notices were posted at market squares, describing them in detail. Rewards were offered for capture, sometimes significant sums that could buy a modest house or feed a family for years. Some townsmen, fearful or eager for coin, helped authorities track these men, even while legends of the outlaw's bravery persisted. To be an outlaw was to be hunted in every sense, legally, socially, and psychologically. Imagine, for a moment, one such outlaw resting after a long day. The forest around him is quiet. A fire crackles gently in a small clearing, smoke curling upward. He sharpens his sword with deliberate strokes. His cloak is worn, patched, and dusted with leaves. A stolen loaf of bread rests on a stone beside him. In the distance, the soft cry of a night bird echoes. He is alive, free for a moment, yet he knows the chase resumes with first light. Every shadow could hide pursuers, every sound could carry danger. Outlaws, despite the peril, captured the imagination of ordinary people. To those who lived under the strict hierarchy of medieval life, the outlaw was a figure who rejected constraints, who claimed self-determination, however violent or imperfect. Tales of their exploits traveled in markets, taverns, and around hearth fires. In songs, they became clever, daring, and untouchable, though the reality was often much darker. Punishments for capture were severe. Hanging was common. For more notorious criminals, execution could be prolonged or gruesome, a warning to others. Some were imprisoned for life, locked away in dungeons where darkness pressed on every side. But even in death, their names lingered, etched into memory, carried in stories, whispered across the countryside. The most dangerous outlaws became, in a way, immortal, their danger remembered long after their flesh had returned to the earth. To be wanted in this way was to live at the edge of the world, in a space outside ordinary society, where laws did not apply and survival depended on cunning, courage, and luck. These outlaws were not merely criminals. They were symbols of defiance, reminders that the medieval world, with all its order and hierarchy, could still be unsettled by those who refused to conform. And so, as we picture them one last time, let us imagine the night forest stretching endlessly, the stars reflected in a distant river. The outlaw moves silently, aware of every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an animal. The fire behind him flickers and dies, leaving him in darkness. He is both hunted and alive, feared and remembered, living on the margins of law and story. And in the background, the soft wind drifts through the trees, carrying the echoes of footsteps, whispers, and the quiet heartbeat of a world that remembers the most wanted of all, resting among the shadows of the past. As the night deepens over our imagined medieval world, we pause, letting the echoes of forests, roads, rivers, and castles settle softly in our minds. We have walked among outlaws in the forest, bandits on lonely roads, pirates on cold seas, rebels rising in defiance, witches gathering herbs, spies whispering secrets, and fugitives seeking freedom. Each of them was wanted, hunted, remembered. Each carried a story of courage, fear, and survival, as real and fragile as the wind through the trees or the flicker of a candle in a quiet hall. It is easy to think of these figures only as criminals or dangers, as shadows in the grand tale of history. But they were also human, living lives shaped by circumstance, by hunger, by hope, by dreams that sometimes stretched beyond the boundaries the world tried to impose. A bandit crouching in a hedgerow, listening for distant wheels, a pirate steering by the moonlight, a serf slipping through the fields under stars. They all moved in spaces between rules, crafting lives that history remembers and whispers. We can picture the quiet moments too, the small intimacies of life behind infamy. The outlaw sharpening a blade by the dying embers of a fire. The healer grinding herbs in a moonlit cottage. The spy rolling letters carefully, breath caught in anticipation. These moments are as human as any festival, any feast, any sermon in a stone church. And in them, we sense that history is not just made in battles and proclamations, but in the subtle rhythms of fear, hope, and determination. The world of medieval times was vast and uneven, filled with authority and hierarchy, yet populated with those who moved along the margins, those who challenged the order in quiet or bold ways. Their names appear in records, in chronicles, in lists of wanted men and women. Some faded quickly into obscurity. Others became legends, songs, and cautionary tales. And now, as we drift with our thoughts, we can imagine these figures lingering somewhere between memory and myth, a reminder that the past is never quite still. As our journey comes to rest, we may close our eyes and let the forest glades, the misty roads, and the distant waves wash over our minds like a slow, steady tide. We may hear the rustle of leaves, the gentle lap of water against the hull, the faint creak of parchment in candlelit chambers. We may sense the breath of those long ago, moving quietly through shadows, living, fleeing, dreaming, and sometimes falling, always remembered by the whispers of time. And as we let these images settle, we may carry the soft lesson of their lives into our own calm hours. That courage, even when it is dangerous or forbidden, leaves a mark. That even in fear, humans seek freedom, connection, and a sense of agency. That stories, whispered in markets, recorded in chronicles, sung by minstrels, endure far longer than the lives themselves. And so, as the night deepens around us, we allow ourselves to drift, gently, safely, into the quiet rhythm of sleep, knowing that the most wanted of medieval times now rest, in memory, and in imagination. Let your thoughts soften like the evening light fading over a castle hill. Let your breathing match the quiet sway of leaves or the distant sigh of waves. Let the echoes of history carry away tension, leaving only the calm, unbroken hush of night. And in this space, your mind can wander freely, slipping among roads and rivers, forests and halls, with no need to chase or flee, only to observe and dream. The most wanted of medieval times were once alive, their hearts beating, their steps hurrying, their names feared and remembered. And now, in our imagining, they are part of the endless story of humanity, moving softly in our minds as we let our own eyes close. Sleep is the next journey, gentle and unhurried, carrying us across centuries, carrying us into rest. So rest quietly, like the world itself after a long day. Let the stories settle, the shadows soften, the whispers fade into lullabies. And in the background, the wind through the trees keeps moving, the water keeps flowing, and the memory of those long ago wanderers drifts with you into calm and sleep.